these infants have been exposed to spike protein and the exosomes and other components throughout the gestation. So they're already born vulnerable.
Their own data showed that their injection was equivalent approximately in its capacity to cause a child to die and be aborted as the abortion pill.
You see a big drop in deaths in 2020, and then we see the continuous rise in infant mortality from 2021, 22 and onwards. Okay, France. I have just 2 slides on France. I took a quick look at France. This is just looking at birth patterns and birth rates. We see it's declining over time, this is from 2000 up to January 2025. And we see the vaccination rolled out in December 2020. And then by 2022, and particularly 23 and 24, births are falling off the charts. This is not an expected pattern. Even with an aging population, you don't expect a fall like this. You expect a trending downwards.
You know, I'm looking at that and I'm thinking of Dr. Thorpe, you know, when he said COVID genetic vaccines are making thalidomide look like a Flintstone vitamin. I'll share the link for that one, folks.
Wow.
It's, you know, even Pfizer's own studies, they tried to obfuscate it in there. The way they reported how many women were injected during pregnancy, and then they reported how many pregnancies were aborted. But what they didn't, you had to look in the middle of the table to see that they actually only reported on a small number. So it was sort of something like 3,000 women injected and 300 miscarriages, which is normal. But in the middle, it said, oh, the number that we reported was around 320. So in reality, their own data showed that their injection was equivalent approximately in its capacity to cause a child to die and be aborted as the abortion pill.
Mm.
And they knew that before we had to watch this data and see poor France's population collapsing.
Yeah, and it's not just that the births are lower, it's what are the health of the surviving infants. And, you know, now we are already seeing the pandemic babies entering kindergarten and, you know, having diagnoses. And when you talk with people working in pediatrics, they're seeing that children are not healthy. And they're seeing the numbers of children with all sorts of learning disabilities and physical disabilities has dramatically increased. So the children are not the same as they were before. And yeah. I have not seen any comprehensive studies looking at health outcomes. I've only seen a few case studies by Nick Hulsher. But I imagine if there was a detailed investigation, we would see dramatic changes in pediatric health and learning ability.
Yeah. I mean, in Canada, at the same time as they were, the supposed authorities were attacking the scientists, doctors, and nurses warning about the injections in kids, and they were saying, no, they're totally safe, give them to all the kids. Simultaneously, you know, for instance, London Hospital opened a stroke department for pediatric strokes. You ever heard of pediatric strokes before the COVID shots? And we now have defibrillators in public schools. So they've normalized heart attacks in children and strokes, but that didn't exist barely at all before the injections that they're still trying to claim are safe and still having the audacity to tell people to inject their kids with a booster.
Yeah, I mean, being an occupational therapist by training, I understand that children did have strokes. It was known, but it was vanishingly rare. And it was often associated with accidents or congenital abnormalities rather than a more general population occurrence.
Yeah, there certainly wasn't enough to open entire departments to treat it, but they did in 2021.
Not at all. Okay, so this is France's infant deaths per 1,000 live births. And this is particularly interesting. This is from 2003, which is the data I could find up to 2024. And we see that infant deaths, infant mortality going down over time, improved medical care, improved infrastructure, improved nutrition. So we see general improvements. And then the trajectory completely. And I have to say that this will also be confounded by infant vaccination schedules. I've seen evidence that changes in infant mortality is related to changes in pediatric vaccination schedules, addition of doses, etc. But overall, there was trending towards lower infant mortality, and that trending was completely reversed from 2020. You see a big drop in deaths in 2020, and then we see the continuous rise in infant mortality from 2021, 22, and onwards.
But I just like to underline that again. You look in recent years, 2020, the year of the scary virus, was actually a low point for infant deaths in France. 2021, introduction of the injection, and you just see a steady upward trend since then. Makes us think of Helen Grews, the Canadian detective, who just asked the question of there was a surge of infant deaths in Canada's capital in Ottawa. And one police detective just asked the question. She said, I want to check the COVID vaccination status of the mothers. And strangely, she was stripped of her career without pay and is the most persecuted police officer in the history of Canada. The Helen Grews Project, folks, I'll share a link for that. Get behind her because that fight isn't over.
Yeah, that's not surprising, unfortunately. It's about hiding what's really happening. So the second half of this slide is looking at infant deaths by age of infant. And what is particularly interesting is that the biggest rise in infant deaths is amongst the very young infants, meaning that infants are being born unhealthy and they're dying early in life, as well as we see a rise in later infant deaths, but a very clear rise in early infant deaths, meaning that these causes are probably related to pregnancy-related health of the infant.
You know, and as a mechanistic thinker looking at that, Sally, you know, I'd like to remind people who have been coerced, who have been injected, having a baby. Up until COVID injections, it was very clear breastfeeding is the way to go. But if you're a mother who's been injected, we may have to reconsider that because there's very real concerns of women exporting messenger RNA and spike protein and exosomes found in the breast milk. And the infant's digestive tract is way more permeable to things like that than it is in a mature tract. So a breastfeeding child who's unfortunately receiving breast milk with exosomes loaded with spike protein and genetic material to poison the child is a different situation. And we're going to really have to rethink how we help young mothers that have been injected. And I can only suspect there's going to be a need for injection-free wet nurses, among other things.
There's not very many of those globally.
No.
The other perspective is that it may be necessary to check breast milk for levels of spike protein to see what is being transmitted to the infant. And the other aspect of this is these infants have been exposed to spike protein and the exosomes and other components throughout the gestation. So they're already born vulnerable.
Yeah. Yeah. That we have to remember, you know, that the pegylated lipid nanoparticles by design cross the placental barrier, and the brain barrier and the ovary barrier. So a female before she's even born has been genetically invaded both into her brain and her ovaries to produce a toxic protein and trigger a whole cascade of harmful effects.
Yeah, and one of the concerns that I think we have to look at is, are these babies born to vaccinated mothers and vaccinated, are they ever going to mature sexually? Because we know that the spike protein accumulates in ovaries and testes and takes over to some extent. And will these children develop normally? The children are only 4 to 5 years old at most now. So we don't know. We have no idea the outcomes.
That's so real, Sally. And, you know, like we have recent literature that was shared by Nick Hulsher and Dr. McCullough showing 30% loss of eggs in a woman's ovaries following so-called COVID vaccination. And when you think about it, unlike males produce sperm all through our life. Females actually produce all their eggs before they're even born. And so when you inject a pregnant woman and you invade the unborn female child's ovaries, you could literally sterilize that child for life before she's even born. And what you're talking about, Sally, is a very serious concern.
Yeah, that's the future of humanity, and I've been looking out for, although I haven't seen anyone yet doing histology of ovarian and testicular tissue from infants who die to see, are their organs normal? I suspect they won't be.
I suspect you're right. And I think that I hope some of our researchers who are watching this are thinking, hey, yeah, it's time to get the microscope out on that one.
They need to start doing the histology on these infants, brain tissue, reproductive organs. Actually, all of the endocrine organs would need to be checked because
Yeah.
it's not just reproductive organs.
Yeah. And friends, if you may be close to someone who has had a child die, perhaps from a COVID vaccinated mother, please look at some of the material I presented on autopsies. You can just search the word autopsy on Dr. Trozy, because there's very specific tests that need to be done. And in general, they are not being done. And by that, I mean immunofluorescence staining for the spike protein and a few other measures. So, folks, if you're close to someone that you've got a dead baby, an aborted baby, try to get some tissue samples. And let's try to get those analyzed properly. And there's some links you'll find when you search autopsy on drtrozy.news.
Yeah, it's absolutely critical that we keep studying this. Particularly, there's many countries still pushing COVID vaccines, including on pregnant women as their priority group.